Hey, Thrilling Suspense fanatics. Today we are continuing with the third part of Vathek, a posthumous collaboration between Clark Ashton Smith and his stylistic influence and subject of some of Clark Ashton Smith's fascination, one William Beckford, whose story is so strange that it really bears consideration in its own right. Put in the most abbreviated terms so that we can begin our tale without too much preamble, he was born into incredible wealth and lived decadently and strangely in a manner indistinguishable from one of Clark Ashton Smith's subjects. So, after his death, he left unfinished notes to the third part of Vathek, and with 17,000 of his words and 4,000 of Clark Ashton Smith's words, we are given this gem of bizarre literature. So, our story continues. The third episode of Vathek, the story of the Princess Zulkaïs and the Prince Kalilah. Part 2. Meanwhile, everything had been made ready within the harem. Screens had been duly ordered, the door curtains had been drawn, and ample draperies hung before the daises in the long gallery that ran around the interior of the building, thus concealing from view the sultanas and the princesses, their daughters. Such elaborate preparations had caused a general ferment, and curiosity was at its height when the hermit, trampling underfoot the ruined fragments of the doorways, entered majestically into the hall of the golden trellises. The magnificence of the palace did not even win from him a passing glance. His eyes remained fixed mournfully on the pavement at his feet. At last he penetrated into the gallery of the women. These latter, who were not at all accustomed to the sight of creatures so lean, gaunt, and gigantic, uttered piercing cries and loudly asked for essences and cordials to enable them to bear up against the apparition of such a phantasm. The hermit paid not the smallest heed to the surrounding tumult. He was gravely pursuing his way when the emir came forward, and, taking him by the skirt of his garment, led him with much ceremony to the dais of the gallery which looked out upon the Nile. Basins of comfits and orthodox liquors were at once served, but though Abu Gabdol Guayman seemed to be dying of hunger, he refused to partake of these refreshments, saying that for 90 years he had drunk nothing but the dew of heaven and eaten only the locusts of the desert. The emir, who regarded this diet as conformable to what might properly be expected of a prophet, did not press him further, but at once entered into the question he had at heart, saying how much it grieved him to be without a male heir, notwithstanding all the prayers offered up to that effect, and the flattering hopes which the imams had given him. "But now," he continued, "I am assured that this happiness will at last be mine. The sages, the mediciners predict it, and my own observations confirm their prognostications. It is not, therefore, with the purpose of consulting you with regard to the future that I have caused you to be summoned. It is for the purpose of obtaining your advice upon the education I should give to the son whose birth I am expecting, or rather, of the 2 sons, for, without doubt, in recognition of my alms, heaven will accord to the Sultana Gulendi Begum a double measure of fertility, seeing that she is twice as large as women usually are on such occasions." Without answering a word, the hermit mournfully shook his head 3 times. My father, greatly astonished, asked if his anticipated good fortune was in any wise displeasing to the holy man. "Ah, too blind prince," replied the hermit, uttering a cavernous sigh which seemed to issue from the grave itself. "Why importune heaven with rash prayers? Respect its decrees. It knows what is best for all men better than they do themselves. Woe be to you, and woe be to the son whom you will doubtless compel to follow in the perverse ways of your own beliefs, instead of submitting himself humbly to the guidance of Providence." If the great of this world could only foresee all the misfortunes they bring upon themselves, they would tremble in the midst of their splendor. Pharaoh recognized this truth, but too late. He pursued the children of Musa in despite of the divine decrees, and died the death of the wicked. What can alms avail when the heart is in rebellion? Instead of asking the prophet for an heir, to be led by you into the paths of destruction, those who have your welfare at heart should implore him to cause Gulendi Begum to die, yes, to die, before she brings into the world presumptuous creatures whom your conduct will precipitate into the abyss. Once again I call upon you to submit. If Allah's angel threatens to cut short the days of the Sultana, do not make appeal to your magicians to ward off the fatal blow. Let it fall, let her die. Tremble not with wrath, Emir, harden your heart. Once again call to mind the fate of Pharaoh and the waters that swallowed him up. Call them to mind yourself, cried my father, foaming with rage and springing from the dais to run to the aid of the Sultana, who, having heard all, had fainted away behind the curtains. Remember that the Nile flows beneath these windows, and that thou hast well deserved that thy odious carcass should be hurled into its waters. I fear not, cried the gigantic hermit in turn. The prophet of Allah fears not but himself. And he rose on the tips of his toes and touched with his hands the supports of the dome of the apartment. "Ha! Ha! Thou fearest nothing!" cried all the women and the eunuchs, issuing like tigers out of their den. "Accursed assassin, thou hast just brought our beloved mistress to death's door, and yet fearest nothing. Go and become food for the monsters of the river." Screaming out these words, they threw themselves all at once on Abu Gabdol Gueman, bore him down, strangled him without pity, and cast his body through a dark grating into the Nile, which there lost itself obscurely among the piers of iron. The emir, astonished by an act at once so sudden and so atrocious, remained with his eyes fixed on the waters, but the body did not again come to the surface, and Shaban, who now appeared upon the scene, bewildered him with his cries. At last he turned to look upon the perpetrators of the crime, but they had scattered in every direction and hidden behind the curtains of the gallery. Each avoiding the other, they were all overwhelmed by the thought of what they had done. Gulendi, who had only come to herself in time to witness this scene of horror, was now in mortal anguish. Her convulsions, her agonizing cries drew the emir to her side. He bedewed her hand with tears. She opened her eyes wildly and cried, "O Allah, Allah, put an end to a wretched creature who has already lived too long, since she has been the cause of so terrible an outrage, and suffer not that she should bring into the world—" "Stop, stop," interrupted the emir, holding her hands which she was about to turn against herself. "Thou shalt not die, and my children shall yet live to give the lie to that demented skeleton, worthy only of contempt. Let my sages be summoned instantly. Let them use all their art to keep thy soul from flitting hence and to save from harm the fruit of thy body." The sages were convened accordingly. They demanded that one of the courts in the palace should be placed entirely at their disposal, and there began their operations, kindling a fire whose light penetrated into the gallery. The Sultana rose from her couch, notwithstanding all the efforts made to restrain her, and ran to the balcony overlooking the Nile. The view from thence was lonely and drear. Not a single boat showed upon the surface of the stream. In the distance were discernible reaches of sand which the wind from time to time sent whirling into the air. The rays of the setting sun dyed the water's blood red. Scarcely had the deepening twilight stretched over the horizon when a sudden and furious wind broke open the latticework of the gallery. The Sultana, beside herself, her heart beating, tried to plunge back into the interior of the apartment, but an irresistible power held her where she was and forced her against her will to contemplate the mournful scene before her eyes. A great silence now reigned. Darkness had insensibly covered the earth. Then, suddenly, a streak of blue light furrowed the clouds in the direction of the pyramids. The princess could distinguish their enormous mass against the horizon as clearly as if it had been noonday. The spectacle thus suddenly revealed chilled her with fear. Several times did she try to call her slaves, but her voice refused its office. She endeavored to clap her hands, but in vain. While she remained thus, as if in the grip of some horrible dream, a lamentable voice broke the stillness and uttered these words: "My latest breath has just been exhaled into the waters of the river. Vainly have thy servants striven to stifle the voice of truth. It rises now from the abysses of death. O wretched mother, see whence issues that fatal light, and tremble." Gulendi Begum endured to hear no more. She fell back senseless. Her women, who had been anxious about her, hurried up at this moment and uttered the most piercing cries. The sages approached and placed into the hands of my father, who was in terrible perturbation, the powerful elixir they had prepared. Scarcely had a few drops fallen on the sultana's breast when her soul, which had seemed about to follow the orders of Azrael, the angel of death, came back as if in nature's despite to reanimate her body. Her eyes reopened to see, still illumining the pyramids, the fatal furrow of blue light which had not yet faded from the sky. She raised her arms, and pointing out to the emir with her finger that dread portent, was seized with the pains of childbirth, and, in the paroxysm of an unspeakable anguish, brought into the world a son and a daughter, the two wretched beings you see before you here. The emir's joy in possession of a male child was greatly dashed when he saw my mother die before his eyes. Notwithstanding his excessive grief, however, he did not lose his head, and at once handed us over to the care of his sages. The nurses, who had been engaged in great number, wished to oppose this arrangement, but the ancient men, all uttering incantations simultaneously, compelled them to silence. The cabalistic lavers in which we were to be immersed stood already prepared. The mixture of herbs exhaled a vapor that filled the whole palace. Shaban, whose very stomach was turned by the odor of these unspeakable drugs, had all the trouble in the world to restrain himself from summoning the imams and the doctors of the law, in order to oppose the impious rites now in contemplation. Would to heaven he had the courage to do so. Ah, how terrible has been the influence upon us of the pernicious immersions to which we were then subjected. In short, Lord, we were plunged, both successively and together, into a hell broth which was intended to impart to us a strength and intelligence more than human, but has only instilled into our veins the ardent elixir of a too exquisite sensibility and the poison of an insatiable desire. It was to the sound of brazen wands beating against the metal sides of the lavers. It was in the midst of thick fumes issuing from heaps of burning herbs that invocations were addressed to the jinns, and specially to those who preside over the pyramids, in order that we might be endowed with miraculous gifts. After this we were delivered over to the nurses, who scarcely could hold us in their arms. Such was our liveliness and vivacity. The good women shed tears when they saw how our young blood boiled within us, and strove in vain to cool its effervescence and to calm us by cleansing our bodies from the reeking mess with which they were still covered. But, alas, the harm was already done. Nay, if even as sometimes happened in after days, we wished to fall into the ordinary ways of childhood, my father, who was determined at all hazards to possess children of an extraordinary nature, would brisk us up with heating drugs and the milk of negresses. We thus became unendurably headstrong and mettlesome. At the age of 7, we could not bear contradiction. At the slightest restraint, we uttered cries of rage and bit those who had us in charge till the blood flowed. Shaban came in for a large share of our attentions in this kind, sighing over us, however, in silence, for the emir only regarded our spitefulness as giving evidence of a genius equal to that of Saurid and Cherubeh. Ah, how little did anyone suspect the real cause of our forwardness. Those who look long into the light are soonest afflicted with blindness. My father had not yet remarked that we were never arrogant and overbearing towards one another, that each was ready to yield to the other's wishes, that Kalilah, my brother, was never at peace save in my arms, and that, as for me, my only happiness lay in overwhelming him with caresses. Up to this time, we had in all things been educated together. The same book was always placed before the eyes of both. Each turned over the leaves alternately. Though my brother was subjected to a course of study rigorous and above his years, I insisted on sharing it with him. Abu Tahir Ahmed, who cared for nothing save the aggrandizement of his son, gave directions that in this I should be humored, because he saw that his son would only fully exert himself when at my side. We were taught not only the history of the most remote ages of antiquity, but also the geography of distant lands. The sages never ceased to indoctrinate us with the abstruse and ideal moral code, which, as they pretended, lurked hidden in the hieroglyphics. They filled our ears with a magnificent verbiage about wisdom and foreknowledge, and the treasure houses of the pharaohs, whom sometimes they compared to ants, and sometimes to elephants. They inspired us with a most ardent curiosity as to those mountains of hewn stone beneath which the Egyptian kings lie sepulchred. They compelled us to learn by heart the long catalogue of architects and masons who had labored at the building of them. They made us calculate the quality of provisions that would be required by the workmen employed, and how many threads went to every ell of silk with which the Sultan Saurid had covered his pyramid. Together with all this rubbish, these most weariful old dotards bewildered our brains with a pitiless grammar of the language spoken of old by the priests in their subterranean labyrinths. The childish games in which we were allowed to indulge during our playtime had no charms for us unless we played them together. The princesses, our sisters, wearied us to death. Vainly did they embroider for my brother the most splendid vests. Kalilah disdained their gifts, and would only consent to bind his lovely hair with the muslin that had floated over the breast of his beloved Zulkaïs. Sometimes they invited us to visit them in the 12 pavilions which my father, no longer hoping to have that number of sons, had abandoned to their use, erecting another and of greater magnificence for my brother and for myself. This latter building, crowned by 5 domes and situated in a thick grove, was, every night, the scene of the most splendid revels in the harem. My father would come thither, escorted by his most beautiful slaves, each holding in her hand a candlestick with a white taper. How many times has the light of these tapers appearing through the trees caused our hearts to beat in sad anticipation. Everything that broke upon our solitude was in the highest degree distasteful. To hide among the leafage and listen to its murmur seemed to us sweeter far than attending to the sound of the lute and song of the musicians. But these soft, luxurious reveries of ours were highly offensive to my father. He would force us back into the cupoladed saloons, and force us to take part in the common amusements. Every year the emir treated us with greater sternness. He did not dare to separate us altogether for fear of the effect upon his son, but tried rather to win him from our languorous dalliance by throwing him more and more into the company of young men his own age. The game of reeds, so famous among the Arabs, was introduced into the courts of the palace. Kalilah gave himself up to the sport with immense energy, but this was only so as to bring the games to a speedier end, and then fly back to my side. Once reunited, we would read together, read of the loves of Joseph and Zuleika, or some other poem that spoke of love, or else, taking advantage of our moments of liberty, we would roam through the labyrinth of corridors looking out upon the Nile. Always with our arms intertwined, always with eyes looking into each other's eyes. It was almost impossible to track us in the mazy passages of the palace, and the anxiety we inspired did but add to our happiness. One evening, when we were tenderly alone together, and running side by side in childish glee, my father appeared before us and shuddered. "Why," he said to Kalilah, "why are you here and not in the great courtyard shooting with the bow, or else with the horse trainers training the horses which are to bear you into battle? Must the sun, as it rises and sets, see you only bloom and fade like a weak narcissus flower? Vainly do the sages try to move you by the most eloquent discourses, and unveil before your eyes the learned mysteries of an older time. Vainly do they tell you of warlike and magnanimous deeds. You are now nearly 13, and never have you evinced even the smallest ambition to distinguish yourself among your fellow men. It is not in the lurking haunts of effeminacy that great characters are formed. It is not by reading love poems that men are made fit to govern nations. Princes must act. They must show themselves to the world. Awake! Cease to abuse my patience, which has too long allowed you to waste your hours by the side of Zulkaïs. Let her, tender creature that she is, continue to play among her flowers, but do you cease to haunt her company from dawn till eve. I see well enough that it is she who is perverting you." Having spoken these words, which he emphasized by angry and threatening gestures, Abu Tahir Ahmed took my brother by the arm and left me in a very abyss of bitterness. An icy numbness overcame me. Though the sun still shed its fullest rays upon the water, I felt as if it had disappeared below the horizon. Stretched at length upon the ground, I did nothing but kiss the sprays of orange flower that Kalilah had gathered. My sight fell upon the drawings he had traced, and my tears fell in greater abundance. "Alas," said I, "it is all over. Our blissful moments will return no more. Why accuse me of perverting Kalilah? What harm can I do to him? How can our happiness offend my father? If it was a crime to be happy, the sages would surely have given us warning." My nurse Shamela found me in this condition of languor and dejection. To dissipate my grief, she immediately led me to the grove where the young girls of the harem were playing at hide-and-seek amid the golden aviaries of which the place was full. I derived some little solace from the song of the birds and the murmur of the rillets of clear water that trickled around the roots of the trees. But when the hour came at which Kalilah was wont to appear, these sounds did but add to my sufferings. Shamala noticed the heavings of my breast. She drew me aside, placed her hand upon my heart, and observed me attentively. I blushed, I turned pale, and that very visibly. "I see very well," said she, "that it is your brother's absence that so upsets you. This is the fruit of the strange education to which you have been subjected. The holy reading of the Koran, the due observance of the Prophet's laws, confidence in the known mercies of Allah, these are as milk to cool the fever heat of human passion. You know not the soft delight of lifting up your soul to heaven and submitting without a murmur to its decrees. The Emir, alas, would forestall the future, while, on the contrary, the future should be passively awaited. Dry your tears. Perchance Kalilah is not unhappy, though distant from your side." "Ah," I cried, interrupting her with a sinister look. "If I were not fully convinced that he is unhappy, I should myself be far more miserable." Shamila trembled at hearing me speak thus. She cried, "Would to heaven that they had listened to my advice and the advice of Shaban, and instead of handing you over to the capricious teaching of the sages, had left you, like true believers, at peace in the arms of blissful and quiet ignorance. The ardor of your feelings alarms me in the very highest degree. Nay, it excites my indignation. Be more calm. Abandon your soul to the innocent pleasures that surround you, and do so without troubling yourself whether Kalilah shares in these pleasures or not. His sex is made for toil and manly hardship. How should you be able to follow him in the chase, to handle a bow, and to dart reeds in the Arab game? He must look for companions manly and worthy of himself, and cease to fritter away his best days here at your side amid bowers and aviaries." This sermon, far from producing its desired effect, made me altogether beside myself. I trembled with rage, and, rising to my feet like one bereft of reason, I rent my veil into 10,000 pieces, and tearing my breast, cried with a loud voice that my nurse had mishandled me. The game ceased. Everyone crowded about me, and though the princesses did not love me overmuch, because I was Kalilah's favorite sister, yet my tears and the blood that flowed from my self-inflicted wounds excited their indignation against Shamela. Unfortunately for the poor woman, she had just awarded a severe punishment to 2 young slaves who had been guilty of stealing pomegranates. And these 2 little vipers, in order to be revenged, bore testimony against her and confirmed all I said. They ran and retailed their lies to my father, who, not having Shaban at his side, and being moreover in a good temper because my brother had just thrown a javelin into a crocodile's eye, ordered Shamela to be tied to a tree and whipped without mercy. Her cries pierced my heart. She cried without ceasing, "Oh, you whom I have carried in my arms, whom I have fed from my breast, how can you cause me to suffer thus? Justify me, declare the truth. It is only because I tried to save you from the black abyss into which your wild and unruly desires cannot fail to precipitate you in the end, that you are thus causing this body of mine to be torn to shreds." I was about to ask that she should be released and spared further punishment, when some demon put into my mind the thought that it was she who, conjointly with Shaban, had inspired my father with the desire of making a hero of Kalilah. Whereupon I armed myself against every feeling of humanity, and cried out that they should go on whipping her till she confessed her crime. Darkness at last put an end to this horrible scene. The victim was unloosed. Her friends, and she had many, endeavored to close her wounds. They asked me, upon their knees, to give them a sovereign balm which I possessed, a balm which the sages had prepared. I refused. Shamala was placed before my eyes on a litter, and, of set purpose, kept for a moment in front of the place where I stood. That breast, upon which I had so often slept, streamed with blood. At this spectacle, at the memory of the tender care she had taken of my infancy, my heart was at last moved. I burst into tears. I kissed the hand she feebly extended to the monster she had nourished in her bosom. I ran to fetch the balm. I applied it myself, begging her at the same time to forgive me, and declaring openly that she was innocent and I alone guilty. This confession caused a shudder to pass among all who surrounded us. They recoiled from me with horror. Shamela, though half dead, perceived this and stifled her groans with the skirt of her garment so as not to add to my despair and the baleful consequences of what I had done. But her efforts were vain. All fled, casting upon me looks that were evil indeed. The litter was removed, and I found myself alone. The night was very dark. Plaintive sounds seemed to issue from the cypresses that cast their shadows over the place. Seized with terror, I lost myself amid the black foliage, prey to the most harrowing remorse. Delirium laid its hand on me. The earth seemed to yawn before my feet, and I to fall headlong into an abyss which had no bottom. My spirit was in this distraught condition when, through the thick underwood, I saw shine the torches of my father's attendants. I noticed that the cortege stopped suddenly. Someone issued from the crowd. A lively presentiment made my heart beat. The footsteps came nearer, and, by the light of a faint and doleful glimmer, such as prevails in the place where we now are, I saw Kalilah appear before me. "Dear Zulkaïs," cried he, intermingling words and kisses, "I have passed an age without seeing you, but I have spent it in carrying out my father's wishes. I have fought with one of the most formidable monsters of the river. But what would I not do when, for recompense, I am offered the bliss of spending a whole evening with you alone? Come, let us enjoy the time to the full. Let us bury ourselves among the trees. Let us, from our retreat, listen disdainful to the tumultuous sound of music and dances. I will cause sherbet and cakes to be served on the moss that borders the little periphery fountain. There I shall enjoy your sweet looks and charming converse till the first dawn of the new day. Then, alas, I must plunge once more into the world's vortex, dart accursed reeds, and undergo the interrogatories of sages." Kalilah said all this with such volubility that I was unable to put in a word. He drew me after him, scarce resisting. We made our way through the leafage to the fountain. The memory of what Shamala had said concerning my excessive tenderness for my brother had, in my own despite, produced a strong impression upon me. I was about to withdraw my hand from his when, by the light of the little lamps that had been lit on the margin of the fountain, I saw his charming face reflected in the waters. I saw his large eyes, dewy with love. I felt his looks pierce to the very bottom of my heart. All my projects of reform, all my agony of remorse, made way for a ferment of very different feelings. I dropped on the ground by Kalilah's side, and leaning his head upon my breast, gave a free course to my tears. Kalilah, when he saw me thus crying passionately, eagerly asked me why I wept. I told him all that had passed between myself and Shamala, without omitting a single particular. His heart was at first much moved by the picture I drew of her sufferings, but, a moment after, he cried, "Let the officious slave perish! Must the heart's soft yearnings ever meet with opposition? How should we not love one another, Zulkaïs? Nature caused us to be born together. Has not nature, too, implanted in us the same tastes and a kindred ardor? Have not my father and his sages made us partakers in the same magic baths? Who could blame a sympathy all has considered to create? No, Zulkaïs, Shaban and our superstitious nurse may say what they please. There is no crime in our loving one another. The crime would rather be if we allowed ourselves, like cowards, to be separated. Let us swear, not by the prophet, of whom we have little knowledge, but by the elements that sustain man's existence. Let us swear that, rather than consent to live without the other, we will take into our veins the soft distillation of the flowers of the stream which the sages have so often vaunted in our hearing. That essence will lull us painlessly to sleep in each other's arms, and so bear our souls imperceptibly into the peace of another existence." These words quieted me. I resumed my ordinary gaiety, and we played and sported together. "I shall be very valiant tomorrow," Kalilah would say, "so as to purchase such moments as these, for it is only by the promise of such a prize that my father can induce me to submit to his fantastic injunctions." "Ha ha!" cried Abu Taher Ahmed, issuing from behind some bushes where he had been listening. "Is that your resolve? We will see if you keep to it. You are already fully paid this evening for the little you have done during the day. Hence. And as to you, Zulkaïs, go and weep over the terrible outrage you have committed against Shamala." In the greatest consternation, we threw ourselves at his feet, but, turning his back upon us, he ordered the eunuchs to conduct us to our separate apartments. It was no scruple with regard to the kind and quality of our love that exercised the emir. His sole end was to see his son become a great warrior and a potent prince, and with regard to the character of the means by which that end was to be obtained, he cared not one tittle. As for me, he regarded me only as an instrument that might have its uses, nor would he have felt any scruples concerning the danger of inflaming our passion by the alternation of obstacles and concessions. On the other hand, he foresaw that indolence and pleasure, too constantly indulged in, must necessarily interfere with his designs. He deemed it necessary, therefore, to adopt with us a harsher and more decided line of conduct than he had hitherto done, and, in an unhappy moment, he carried that resolution into effect. Alas, without his precautions, his projects, his accursed foresight, we should have remained in innocence and never been brought to the horror of this place of torment. The emir, having retired to his apartments, caused Shaban to be summoned and imparted to him his fixed resolve to separate us during a certain time. The prudent eunuch prostrated himself immediately with his face to the ground, and then, rising to his feet, said, "Let my lord forgive his slave if he ventures to be of a different opinion. Do not loose upon this nascent flame the winds of opposition and absence, lest the final conflagration should be such as you are unable to master. You know the prince's impetuous disposition. His sister has today given proofs, only too signal, of hers. Suffer them to remain together without contradiction. Leave them to their childish propensities. They will soon grow tired of one another, and Kalilah, disgusted with the monotony of the harem, will beg you on his knees to remove him from its precincts." "Have you done talking your nonsense?" interrupted the emir impatiently. "Ah, how little do you know the genius of Kalilah! I have carefully studied him. I have seen that the operations of my sages have not been void of their effect. He is incapable of pursuing any object with indifference. If I leave him with Zulkaïs, he will be utterly drowned in effeminacy. If I remove her from him, and make their reunion the price of the great things I require at his hands, there is nothing of which he will not prove himself capable. Let the doctors of our law dote as they please. What can their idle drivel matter so long as he becomes what I desire him to be? Know besides, O eunuch, that when he has once tasted the delights of ambition, the idea of Zulkaïs will evaporate in his mind as a light morning mist absorbed into the rays of the noonday sun, the sun of glory. Therefore, enter tomorrow morning into the chamber of Zulkaïs, forestall her awakening, wrap her up in these robes, and convey her, with her slaves and all that may be necessary to make her life pleasant, to the borders of the Nile, where a boat will be ready to receive you. Follow the course of the stream for 29 days. On the 30th you will disembark at the Isle of the Ostriches. Lodge the princess in the palace which I have built for the use of the sages who roam those deserts, deserts replete with ruins and wisdom. One of these sages you will find there, called the palm tree climber, because he pursues his course of contemplation upon the tops of the palm trees. This ancient man knows an infinite number of stories, and it will be to his care to divert Zulkaïs, for I know very well that next to Kalilah, stories are the chief object of her delight." Shaban knew his master too well to venture upon any further opposition. He went, therefore, to give the necessary orders, but sighed heavily as he went. He had not the slightest desire to undertake a journey to the Isle of Ostriches, and had formed a very unfavorable opinion of the palm tree climber. He was himself a faithful Mussulman, and held the sages and all their works in abomination. Everything was made ready all too soon. The agitation of the previous day had greatly fatigued me, so that I slept very heavily. I was taken from my bed so quietly, and carried with such skill, that I never awoke till I was at a distance of 4 leagues from Cairo. Then the noise of the water gurgling round the boat began to alarm me. It filled my ears strangely, and I half fancied I had drunk the beverage spoken of by Kalilah, and had been borne beyond the confines of our planet. I lay thus, bewildered with strange imaginings, and did not dare to open my eyes, but stretched out my arms to feel for Kalilah. I thought he was by my side. Judge of the feelings of hateful surprise to which I was doomed when, instead of touching his delicate limbs, I seized hold of the horny hand of the eunuch who was steering the boat, and was even older and more grotesquely ugly than Shaban himself. I sat up and uttered piercing cries. I opened my eyes and saw before me a waste stretch of sky and of water bounded by bluish banks. The sun was shining in its fullness. The azure heavens caused all nature to rejoice. 1,000 river birds played around amid the water lilies, which the boat shore through at every moment, their large yellow flowers shining like gold and exhaling a sweet perfume. But all these objects of delight were lost upon me, and, instead of rejoicing my heart, filled me with a somber melancholy. Looking about me, I saw my slaves in a state of desolation, and Shaban, who, with an air at once of discontent and authority, was making them keep silence. The name of Kalilah came at every moment to the tip of my tongue. At last I spoke it aloud, with tears in my eyes, and asked where he was and what they intended to do with me. Shaban, instead of replying, ordered his eunuchs to redouble their exertions, and to strike up an Egyptian song and sing in time to the cadence of their oars. Their accursed chorus rang out so potently that it brought an even worse bewilderment to my brain. We shot through the water like an arrow. It was in vain that I begged the rowers to stop, or at least tell me where I was going. The barbarous wretches were deaf to my entreaties. The more insistent I was, the louder did they roar out their detestable songs so as to drown my cries. Shaban, with his cracked voice, made more noise than the rest. Nothing can express the torments I endured, and the horror I felt at finding myself so far from Kalilah, and on the waters of the fearful Nile my terrors increased with nightfall. I saw, with an inexpressible anguish, the sun go losing itself in the waters, its light in 1,000 rays trembling upon their surface. I brought to mind the quiet moments which, at the same hour, I had passed with Kalilah, and hiding my head in my veil, I gave myself up to despair. Soon a soft rustling became audible. Our boat was sheering its way through the banks of reeds. A great silence succeeded to the song of the rowers, for Shaban had landed. He came back in a few moments, and carried me to a tent erected a few paces from the river's bank. I found there lights, mattresses, stretched on the ground, a table covered with various kinds of food, and an immense copy of the Quran unfolded. I hated the holy book. The sages, our instructors, had often turned it into ridicule, and I had never read it with Kalilah, so I threw it contemptuously to the ground. Shaban took upon himself to scold me, but I flew at him, and endeavored to reduce him to silence. In this I proved successful, and the same treatment retained its efficacy during the whole course of the long expedition. Our subsequent experiences were similar to those of the first day. Endlessly did we pass banks of water lilies and flocks of birds, and an infinite number of small boats that came and went with merchandise. At last we began to leave behind us the plain country. Like all who are unhappy and thus led to look forward, I kept my eyes continually fixed on the horizon ahead of us, and one evening I saw, rising there, great masses of much greater height, and of a form infinitely more varied than the pyramids. These masses proved to be mountains. Their aspect inspired me with fear. The terrible thought occurred to me that my father was sending me to the woeful land of the Negro king, so that I might be offered up as a sacrifice to the idols who, as the sages pretended, were greedy of princesses. Shaban perceived my increasing distress, and at last took pity upon me. He revealed our ultimate destination, adding that though my father wished to separate me from Kalilah, it was not forever, and that in the meanwhile I should make the acquaintance of a marvelous personage called the Palm Tree Climber, who was the best storyteller in the universe. This information quieted me to some extent. The hope, however distant, of seeing Kalilah again poured balm into my soul. And I was not sorry to hear that I should have stories to my liking, Moreover, the idea of a realm of solitude, such as the Ostrich Isle, flattered my romantic spirit. If I must be separated from him who I cherished more than life itself, I preferred to undergo my fate rather in some savage spot than amid the glitter and chatter of a harem. Far from all such impertinent frivolities, I purposed to abandon my whole soul to the sweet memories of the past, and give a free course to the languorous reveries in which I could again see the loved image of my Kalilah. With that, we shall end the second part of this reading. I think it fair to say that in William Beckford's part, which we are still reading, Clark Ashton Smith has not begun to write, as far as I understand the text to read, that we are getting something of the autobiographical from William Beckford. These twins, who are so wanton and perverse and bizarre in their proclivities, who are so out of step with the world around them, and out of step with the wishes of their father, may be analogues for the bizarre William Beckford. I'm not really sure. I'm not an expert on William Beckford, but I can't help projecting that notion into the text as I read it. So, we have one more part, and during that last part, Clark Ashton Smith will take over. While I enjoy Beckford's prose, the moment that Clark Ashton Smith takes over is a revelation. His description, his vocabulary, to me, explodes from the page, and I am very excited to share that with you. So, as always, like, comment, subscribe, and check out the link in the description box below where you can purchase my work, Thrilling Suspense Fantasy Volumes 1 and 2, which supports this channel. All right, I will see you in the next video.